This is the time of the year for green beans. Green beans play a huge role in the food scene of Appalachia. Most folks have their favorite go-to varieties that they grow year after year. Some families are lucky enough to have bean seed that's been passed down through the generations. So they're literally growing the same bean that their great-grandparents grew, which is extremely cool if you ask me. When I was growing up, Pap and Granny's choice green bean to grow was white half runners. White half runner is a pole bean. It has runners on it. They grow from 4 to 10 feet, sometimes even longer than that. So having something for them to grow on is a must. Some people build really elaborate trellises, but most people use a combination of wire and string as they stretch along the rows, and that gives the beans something to climb up because they're so prolific, you just have to have something. But white half runner is a very popular type of bean to grow in the southern mountains of Appalachia. And I'll put a link for you down below in the description so that you can see how Pap used to build his trellises to grow his beans on. And that's the way we grew ours for years. This is the very first year that we've used cattle panels for our beans to grow on. And it's worked out so well that I think from now on we'll continue to use the cattle panels. We grow a combination of white half runners, greasy back beans, and an old bush bean called a yonce bean that's been passed down in a family, like one of those lucky families. The beans have been passed down in the Junaluska area of Cherokee County for over 100 years in that family, the Lambert family. Greasy back beans are also a climbing bean, just like the white half runner, so you have to have something for them to grow on, although they usually don't have as long of runners, although I guess in cases they can. But the unusual name, greasy back beans, it comes from the fact that on the bean, when you pick it, if you look, it's almost like someone's took a vegetable oil or olive oil or something and just lightly brushed it over the edge over the top of the bean, each side of the bean, so it leaves a little greasy sheen on it. So that's why they're called greasy back. All the variety of beans that we grow are string beans, so they all have to be strung before you eat them. And the most common way of cooking green beans in Appalachia is to stew them in a pot of water with seasoning, with ham, with bacon, with salt pork, which is also called, here it's called fatback, streakoline, or fatback, I said fatback, streakoline, streaked meat. That was the other one, streaked meat. Anyway, those are all salt pork, and different people call them different things. But if you don't like meat, a small amount of vegetable oil or olive oil can also be used to season your beans, and then you'd add salt and pepper. And the beans are slow simmered until they reach their desired tenderness, however how you'd like to eat them. In Appalachia, that's a long time usually. I've heard other people say they can't stand beans like that because they're mushy, but I don't really think of them as being mushy. I think of them as being done, so it's just kind of what you get used to. But with our excess green beans that we grow in the garden, we eat a lot of them fresh, but the excess ones we can, using a pressure canner, and we can them for winter storage so that we have something to eat in the winter. Another way to preserve green beans is to dry them. Have you ever heard of leather britches? Leather britches is simply dried green beans. Back in the day, before pressure canners were common and canning jars even, that was the way a lot of people preserved their beans for winter use, was they dried them. In my area of Appalachia, they're called, like I said, leather britches. In other areas, they're called shucky beans or shuck beans, either one. But I looked in my dictionary of Smoky Mountain English, and this is what the entry for the leather britches in it. Leather britches, green beans put on a thread or string as at a bean stringing, dried in the pod by hanging on the porch or by the fireplace or by laying in trays or on scaffolds in the sun, and preserved for later boiling in water for winter consumption. 1913, Cape Art, our southern highlanders. Beans dried in the pod, then boiled, hull and all, are called leather britches. 1939, Hall Collection, Hazel Creek, North Carolina. They dry their beans. Yes, they dry leather britches beans, they called it. I dry mine in the sun. My grandmother dried hers on a string, hung them up in the porch or around the fireplace and dried them. I still dry those leather britches beans. That's what they called them here. 1957, Paris, My Mountains, My People. It's a flour sack filled with dried beans in the hull, which mountain folks call leather britches. 1975, Jackson's Unusual Words. Dried beans had numerous names: leather britches, fodder beans, shuck beans, and dry hulls. 1977, Shields, Cades Cove. These were known as leather britches, and when rehydrated, cooked, and properly seasoned, they were delicious. 1978 Montgomery white pine collection. Our beans, we would dry them. They called them leather britches, and you'd string them on your string till you got something like a yard long. Then you'd hang them in the smokehouse or somewhere when it was warm, and they'd dry out. Then all you'd have to do in the winter, if you took a notion for green beans, why, you could just go out and get your leather britches, put them in water and soak them overnight, and you'd just have a livelier spell of green beans than you ever had when they come out of the garden. 1982, Smoky's Heritage. Long string beans strung together by needle and thread, then hung upon the cabin or smokehouse wall to dry. 1986, Lucinda Ogle. So they would dry fruit and berries of all kinds, also string green beans with a needle and thread and hang to dry. These were called fodder or leather britches. In my area of Appalachia, the dried beans are most often called leather britches. The method of drying the beans varies from family to family. Cooking leather britches is a bit more trouble than cooking fresh green beans. The dried beans must be washed, and then they must be soaked in water to be reconstituted a bit before you actually cook them. And you discard the water, and then you cook them in fresh water, much like you would fresh green beans with the seasoning. The texture is quite different, though, from fresh green beans. It's more of has a richer, deeper taste, like most dried things, and the broth from leather britches almost makes it's a thicker broth than if you just cooked regular green beans. But it is an acquired taste, and some people like it and some people don't like it. Although I'd heard of leather britches my whole life, I never cooked them until I made them myself. Pap and Granny never made leather britches. I guess they preferred the taste of fresh green beans, or green beans that come out of a jar that they'd canned, from their garden each year. But when I decided I was going to make them, probably about 15 or 16 years ago, I researched. I read the Foxfire books. I got out my other Appalachian cooking books. I asked friends and neighbors and community members, and what I quickly found out was that everyone had their own way of doing it. Some people said you should go ahead and string and break the bean up, and then you thread the pieces of bean on your string with your needle and thread. Other people said, no, you got to leave the bean whole, do it that way. Then my mother-in-law, she said, well, my grandmother didn't do that at all. She just put them out, spread them out on a screen, and then she set them outside in the sunshine, and then she brought them back in every night and kept doing that until they were dry. But even the sunshine was a matter of debate. Some people said, no, you can't put them in direct sunlight. It needs to be indirect sunlight. Other people, like Miss Cindy's grandmother, said, put them in direct sunlight and they dry faster, and then you have it over with. Even how to store them. Some people said, oh, I leave mine strung up just where they're at, and then when I need them, I go in there and snip me a string and cook them up. And other people said, no, I wouldn't leave them up where the dust and stuff could get on them. I take mine down and I shake out the dust and I put them in a paper bag, paper poke, and I store them until I'm ready to have them. Then other people said, oh, I'm afraid they'll get bugs in them, so I put them in the freezer after I take them down. So it was just a variety of different ways. Everywhere I looked, it seemed like somebody had a different option of how they did it. So how did I end up doing it? How did I decide this is the best way for me to do it? So this is what I do. So I get my needle and thread. I already string the green beans. I've already pulled the strings off, and then I just go through one end. And I don't worry about whether or not it goes through a bean. I just put it on there. And the one thing I was reading from the Dictionary of Smoky Mountain English is about right. You want the string to be about a yard long. This is not going to be a yard long because I was lazy and I didn't want to rethread the needle. And this is just what was already in there from the last thing I sewed. But you want them to be about a yard long. It can be shorter or longer, ever what you want. And then, so what do I do with them? I dry them. I've dried them on the porch before, and that's in indirect sunlight. My porch is covered so it doesn't get full sun. I've dried them in the living room before. As far as storing them, I just leave them on the string until I'm ready to use them. Let's see, what else? But mostly what I discovered, it's what I wanted to say, mostly what I discovered is I was worrying way too much. It's just dried green beans. Any of those combinations that people shared with me would work. Any way you want to do it would work. You could even use your dehydrator if you have one at home. I'm sure that would work. That'd be great. I've never tried that. But it's just drying green beans. I was making it a whole lot harder to think about than it really is. And that's probably why there's so many different variations. People just found what worked best for them, and that's how they did it. And that's how they found it And it all worked. The main key is you just have to keep them away from moisture, and as long as you do that, you'll be golden. And then you can have some leather breeches to eat. It's funny, I don't think they're as popular, of course, today as they were in days gone by, but I do hear a lot of people, they tell me that they make at least, you know, a few strings each year or dry a few messes each year, either way they do it, so that they can have them for Thanksgiving and Christmas, so they can be on the table with all that other goodness, because their mother or their grandmother always had leather breeches at Christmas or during Thanksgiving. I hope you enjoyed hearing about green beans in Appalachia and learning about leather breeches. And if you did, I hope you'll subscribe to my channel. Tell your friends and neighbors if you think they'll be interested. But mostly, I just hope you drop back by often as I celebrate Appalachia.